Wonderful. Okay, I think we're ready to start. Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Blahos, and I am a senior advisor to the Quincy Institute and editorial director for our online magazine, Responsible Statecraft. I am proud to introduce today's panel, Active Denial, a roadmap to a more effective, stabilizing, and sustainable U.S. defense strategy in Asia. If you do not know much about the Quincy Institute, we are a think tank based in Washington, working to change the way Washington thinks, specifically about foreign policy and the ways the United States has long used its military to advance its interests and resolve differences abroad. We are committed to pursuing a foreign policy that instead utilizes diplomatic powers of engagement and informed strategy to maintain balance, peace, and U.S. interests at home. Today's discussion is the result of a multi-year study by 3 members of our Institute's East Asia program and several external partners, spearheaded by former QI research fellow Rachel Esplin Odell, who I will turn the mic over to momentarily, to lay out a safer military strategy for the United States and Asia. The strategy, called Active Denial, was released in June and outlines the military posture needed to reduce chances of escalation in the event of conflict, while ensuring that any Chinese military offensive cannot succeed. Considering that NATO just announced in its new strategic concept last week that China and its security and our security in the Asia Pacific was now a priority for the NATO alliance, I can think of no better time than to be offering alternative measures to the status quo thinking about this regional challenge. I can attest that my colleagues and their partners on the team have been working overtime for months to put this final report together, and it is a testament to their combined expertise on the region and military strategy overall. In short, there is a lot of firepower here, and we are in for a real treat as they break down their major findings for us today. There's nothing else out there today in the Asia Pacific security space, and I'm proud to be part of the organization that produced it. With that, I will introduce our esteemed panelists and then turn it over to Rachel, who will be your moderator for the next hour. So first, my colleague Michael Swain is director of Quincy's East Asia program. Previously, he served as senior fellow specializing in Chinese defense, foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and East Asia international relations at the Carnegie Institute. He has also authored and edited more than a dozen books and monographs, including Remaining Aligned on the Challenges Facing Taiwan in 2019 with Ro Sahishi, Conflict and Cooperation in the Asia Pacific Region, a Strategic Net Assessment with Nicholas Eberstadt, and many journal articles and book chapters. Swain is directing, along with Ian Johnson of Harvard University, a multi-year crisis prevention project with Chinese partners. Mike Mochizuki holds the Japan-U.S. Relations Chair in memory of Gaston Ségur at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University and is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. He directs the Elliott School's undergraduate degree programs and co-directs the Memory and Reconciliation in the Asia Pacific Project at the Ségur Center. He was Associate Dean for Academic Programs at the Elliott School from 2010 to 2014 and director of the Ségur Center for Asian Studies from 2001 to 2005. And he has also served as senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and has been with RAND. Eric Higginbotham is a principal research scientist at MIT Center for International Studies and a specialist in Asia security issues. Before joining MIT, he was a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he held research projects on China, Japan, and regional security issues, and regularly briefed senior military intelligence and political leaders. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow of Asian Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. And last but not least, Rachel Odell is an expert in U.S. strategy toward Asia, China's foreign policy, and the politics of the law at sea. She was a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in 2020 and 21 and received her PhD from MIT. Odell previously worked as a research analyst in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and served in the China Affairs Bureau for the Office of the US Trade Representative, and her writings have appeared in Foreign Affairs, War on the Rocks, New York Times, Washington Post, National Interest, and others. So with that, I would love to get this discussion started. So I will be handing it over to Rachel, and I will be back to close the proceedings in about an hour. And don't forget, if you have questions for the panel, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and Rachel will be able to get to them at her leisure throughout the hour. So thank you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And it's great to be back here. I left the Quincy Institute last August to take a position as a foreign affairs analyst at the State Department. But working on this project was one of the highlights of my time at the Quincy Institute. And it's great to now see it finally out in the open. And I do want to just note that though I now work for the State Department, my views are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the State Department or the US government. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's dig right in. I want to introduce the project, and then I'll turn it over to my co-authors here to talk about specific aspects of the project. But I want to note before even beginning that we're just 4 of the 10 authors on this project, and you can see the full list of authors on the Quincy Institute website. You go to the homepage, quincyinst.org, and our report is highlighted there. And this was really a product of many experts, and we'll talk more about that going forward. But we're excited to introduce the report to you among the 4 of us today. This report was motivated by an awareness that as China's military power has grown over the past 3 decades, US military dominance in the Western Pacific has eroded significantly. Now, but efforts by the United States to restore military dominance in the region are unlikely to succeed. Not only would such efforts prove financially unsustainable, they could also backfire by exacerbating the risk of crises, conflict, and rapid escalation in a war. At the same time, the United States and various countries in the region have legitimate concerns about how China intends to apply its growing military capabilities. The possibility that Beijing could use force against Taiwan or against US allies in disputes over islands and maritime jurisdiction raises the specter of a direct US-China war. China's increasing use of diplomatic and economic coercion against other states in geopolitical disputes also heightens other countries' general anxiety about how Beijing might use military force for coercive purposes. Faced with these trends, the United States needs a more credible, stabilizing, and affordable defense strategy for deterring potential use of military force by China, combined with a diplomatic strategy to reduce military tensions and improve crisis management. In order to develop such a strategy, we convened a group of 10 top experts, including scholars and defense analysts, as well as former senior level officials in the military, Office of Management and Budget, and the intelligence community. Through a series of structured discussions, war games, and 4 separate working groups with a broader set of around 20 additional experts, we developed a detailed roadmap for how to implement a US defense strategy in Asia that meets 3 key goals. First, to effectively deter potential aggression. Second, to enhance stability and limit risks of rapid and nuclear escalation. And third, to remain affordable under tighter fiscal constraints. Now, one point I want to make up front is that this project is focused on defense strategy, not grand strategy. A few of us, Michael Swain, Jessica Lee, and myself, did publish a report at the Quincy Institute last year on a broader strategy for how the United States should seek to build a more inclusive and balanced regional order in Asia, including through emphasizing diplomatic and economic engagement in the region, which should be central to any strategy that the United States adopts towards the Asia Pacific or elsewhere. But the 10 authors of this new active denial report, in focusing on defense strategy, have some differing views on some of these key big picture grand strategy questions. We discussed these issues in structured discussions at the start of the project. Questions about the nature of China's intentions, the scope of US interests in Asia, the purpose of US defense strategy in Asia, and our longer term vision for US strategy in the region. You can read more about the range of views we have on these issues in the first chapter of the report. We also found, though, over the course of this project, that we didn't have to agree on these points in order to reach consensus on the best defense strategy for the United States and Asia. In fact, we believe that the diversity of views among us on these questions reflect the strength of our recommendations for defense strategy. Officials in the executive and legislative branches and in the broader US foreign policy community also disagree over things like the nature of China's intentions and the purpose of US defense strategy in Asia in the medium and long terms. The recommendations of this report can appeal to a broad range of those practitioners, which is exactly what we need in a political climate where partisan or ideological gridlock often gets in the way of more rational defense policy and budgeting. So with that initial introduction to the purpose of this project, I now want to turn it over to my co-authors here to talk about some of the specific aspects of the project. And then of course, we'll open this up to questions from the audience. So go ahead and start introducing those as they arise, and we'll weave those into the discussion. But first, I want to turn it over to Eric Hegenbotham to describe what the defense strategy that we propose in this report, which we call active denial, actually is, and why we need it, and how it compares to the status quo. So Eric, go ahead.
Thanks to all of you for joining today, for Rachel, to Rachel for her really sterling leadership throughout the course of the project, and obviously for kicking off the meeting today, as well as thanks to Kelly. As Rachel noted, we had 10 authors on the report. It was really an all-star cast, so I felt honored to work with them. On the topics of strategy and force structure and force posture, Brian Killo, Brad Martin, and Stephen Koziak were the most heavily involved, but we had inputs from the entire group. Okay, so to answer the question, I guess I would start with why we wanted to re-examine US strategy. And I think in starting there, we might outline a few propositions very briefly. The first is just as Rachel noted, the balance of power in Asia is both challenging and fundamentally different from that in other regions, especially Europe. In Asia, there's a massive asymmetry of economic resources, with a Chinese economy that's 4 times larger than that of the second largest economy in the region, that of Japan, and thereby much larger than the third, fourth, and fifth. Without nuclear weapons, none of these countries can reasonably be expected to defend themselves without US help. Now, we could discuss what that really means, the specific scenarios. I'm not suggesting China has the intention to invade, multiple states in Asia, or that it necessarily could invade some of those states, Japan, for example. But all the states of Asia are vulnerable to attacks of one form or another that might threaten their sovereignty without US assistance or without their going nuclear. So this really does impinge on proliferation issues, among others. Even with US forces in the region, the balance is challenging during peacetime and would also be so at the initial stages of any sort of conflict. It's worth noting that despite the size and power of the US military, and we're all familiar with its massive budget, only about 10 to 15% of US military assets are deployed in the Western Pacific. Those are concentrated in Japan, Korea, and Guam. Many more could be flown into the theater or driven into the theater in the case of ships, but these would not be available at the outset. Okay, a second proposition is just that US resources are obviously limited, probably becoming more so given domestic needs, and there's little or no room to increase the defense budget further. Certain options, especially highly offensive ones, may be off the table for that reason. Offensive options sort of associated with strategies of dominance are probably non-starters at this point. They're highly expensive. Yet US operational concepts during the post-Cold War period in particular have depended heavily on offensive action. Now that's changing to an extent now, but very inconsistently so, and we can get into some of those specifics later if we want to. And then finally, a third proposition is that highly offensive strategies, particularly when the forces to execute them are deployed forward and not well defended and are left vulnerable, that undermines crisis stability and provides incentives for both sides to strike first during a crisis. As a consequence of those developments or trend lines, as Rachel mentioned, the criteria we used to evaluate strategy were threefold: deterrence efficacy, cost, and impact on stability. All right, in considering military strategy, we really wanted to work from broad principles, and we examined 3 general approaches: punishment, control, and denial. So military strategies or deterrent strategies of punishment, control, and denial. The first of these, deterrence by punishment, that's a concept that's really as old as man, but has received the most sort of scholarly attention in the nuclear age. And although it's associated with nuclear weapons, it can be executed through conventional means. But such a strategy is inherently escalatory and extraordinarily dangerous against a nuclear foe. We didn't spend a lot of time examining it, but we did think about it, particularly in the context of Japan, which in some ways is playing at the margins of such a strategy, possibly. Okay, that leaves control and denial strategies, military strategies of control and denial. Now, early nuclear theorists, if we want to sort of go back to lexicon a little bit, early nuclear strategists juxtaposed strategies of punishment and strategies of denial. Now, unfortunately, if you're studying conventional deterrence or conventional strategy, it's not terribly useful because it leaves almost all of your possible conventional strategies in sort of one category. Again, not terribly useful. It's also not useful, or I think in a sense unfortunate, because that label has been used in other military contexts in a very specific meaning. So we borrowed the language from an older historical tradition to, again, sort of contrast strategies of control with strategies of denial. So a control strategy is a strategy that looks to dominate all or most parts of a potential battle area and to deter by confronting an adversary with the prospect of rapid and relatively comprehensive defeat. This approach can be primarily defensive when powerful forces are kept forward to stop an adversary, but because when you're on the defensive, you have the potential for losing ground, most of these strategies almost invariably have provisions for early counterattack. In fact, some are really oriented around offensive military concepts of operation. So for those of you familiar with military history, France's Plan D before World War II called for an attack into Belgium in the case of a German attack on France. And the airland battle of the late Cold War called for counteroffensives against a Soviet invasion of East Germany. So that's a strategy of control. It's not synonymous with the offensive, but it generally has very heavy offensive components. Denial strategies, on the other hand, are focused on husbanding military resources, avoiding catastrophic defeat, attriting an adversary until such time as the correlation of forces improves and more conventional military operations can be conducted to retake any lost ground. So denial strategies trade time and a degree of access by the adversary for the ability to improve the correlation of forces over time. They may be sort of purely Fabian strategies like modern insurgencies, in Afghanistan or elsewhere, or very often they include a mix of light irregular forces with more conventionally organized forces operating from some kind of political or geographic sanctuary. So here we can think of the American Revolution, where you had a conventional continental army combined with state militias, or the British and the Spanish insurgents operating in the peninsula during the Napoleonic War. We have naval variants of this. We have air variants of this in the Battle of Britain that we could get into. Generally, if you have sort of overwhelming force, a strategy of control is preferred. You're not giving the adversary access to your territory. You're limiting the amount of harm done to your economy. But nevertheless, all that said, the control strategy, when it fails, it tends to fail very badly since it commits high-end forces to the deciding conflict early on. It requires that the defender can marshal superior forces forward at the outset, despite the fact that an adversary gets to pick the timing of an attack on you. So it's expensive, and it also can be quite destabilizing in the sense that it requires you to maintain these counteroffensive forces far forward. All right, so being the weaker party, particularly if you're weaker at the outset, but you have some hope of shifting the military balance, a denial strategy is often preferred. As we've mentioned, this is precisely the situation that we have in Asia. China would have enormous advantages at the outset, but the US could flow forces into the theater to change the balance of power over time. So this is the strategy we wanted to develop and sort of enunciate, a denial strategy that was tailored for Asia in the particular technological circumstances in which we live. That would have a number of characteristics. I'm not going to get into the forces, at least not now, but just to sort of tick off some of the characteristics that the strategy would have. First, it would have, it would include phases of operations that would include blunting the attack first and then assembling forces for a counterattack later. So it'd be defensive at the outset. Secondly, a heavy emphasis on resilience during peacetime and then during the early stages of conflict. So essentially what we're talking about here is the ability to absorb attack or withstand attack and continue to function, continue to attrit an adversary. Third would be an emphasis on defensive operations and to the extent you undertake strike, more localized strike. Now, this is particularly true at the outset. This would be a highly defensive concept at the outset, and then the sort of counterattack forces would flow into theater. Fourth is a division of labor with allies, and Mike Mochizuki will get into that in more detail later, so we'll leave it there. But here I just say that the allies are the ones in the theater, right? We have 10% of our forces forward deployed. They have 100% of theirs. Sort of stands to reason that their forces should be tailored for that first phase, really for denial. Ours would be more of a mix. And then limited scope of conflict and limited aims. The point here is that we would focus the strategy on the defeat of forces actually engaged in attacking rather than sort of expanding the operation to paralyze the entire military or political structure of, say, China or an adversary in Asia. So I'm sorry, I've gone on too long already, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eric, for giving that introduction to what active denial is and why it's really the direction that we need to be headed. And I'll turn it over to Mike Mochizuki, who led our chapter on the role that allies and partners should play in active denial. And also Jessica Lee and Eric Higginbotham made major contributions to that chapter as well. But we'll turn it over to Mike to introduce the arguments there.
Well, first, I want to join Eric and thanking you, Rachel, for your great leadership in this project, and the Quincy Institute for sponsoring this endeavor. To answer your question on the role of allies and partners in this active denial strategy, I think it's important to stress that we were very sensitive to two closely related dilemmas that allies and partners have in the context of the changing balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region. One of these dilemmas is that our allies and partners want the United States to continue their security commitment and military presence in the region, but at the same time, our allies and partners do not want that commitment and military presence to be escalatory and confrontational against China. The second related dilemma is that our allies and partners want to preserve and even enhance security cooperation with the United States, but they do not want to destabilize their respective relations with China and have to choose between the United States and China. And our conclusion is that the active denial strategy hits that sweet spot and kind of basically being very sensitive to these dilemmas. Now, in terms of the concrete roles that any ally or partner may play in an active denial strategy, we were very cognizant that the seriousness of these dilemmas will vary from country to country. And so we considered the geographic location of each country, their national capabilities and potential. Thirdly, their vulnerability to Chinese economic and military coercion. And fourth, their domestic politics. And so in the terms of the overall picture for what we want our allies and partners to do is that we first support the United States moving beyond the traditional bilateral hub and spokes alliance system. And we support further cooperation between US allies and partners, such as cooperation between Japan and Australia, Japan and the Philippines, or Japan and South Korea. Now, moving beyond the hub and spokes alliance system does not mean that we support the creation of some sort of closed wheel that grinds up against China in a confrontational containment strategy. So what we support is more of a security lattice structure in which some allies become the operational locus of an active denial strategy. And here I'm thinking in particular of Japan and Australia with respect to China and the Republic of Korea and Japan regarding North Korea. But other allies and partners which are more prone to hedging will have subsidiary or residual roles in an active denial strategy. For example, by providing ad hoc access during crises or providing intelligence sharing or surveillance. Now, the other thing about this security lattice structure that we envision is that it would not foreclose diplomatic opportunities to mitigate regional security dilemmas and promote tension reduction and confidence building, things that I'm sure Michael Swain will talk about because he wrote a chapter in the report on that subject.
Great, thanks very much, Mike, for that introduction. And yes, now we'll turn it over to Michael, who wrote a chapter together with John Culver's contributions on how China would likely view active denial and ways that we can mitigate some of the negative security competition that will inevitably accompany any US defense strategy in Asia when it comes to China. So Michael, do you want to speak to this subject?
Sure, thanks very much, Rachel. And I really appreciate being part of this project. It's really, as people have already said, it's really been a unique effort, and I think has produced really a unique document that's nowhere, there's nothing like it out there in the public sphere that I know of, that really looks in such detail and extended detail and careful analysis of the different dimensions of the security situation in the Western Pacific and how the United States should position itself. My task was to look at China and China's response to this kind of a strategy. I should just add before I begin with this, that all of our analysis was also informed by various working groups that the project convened during the course of the project, of experts in all of these areas that we worked in. Although they were not the authors and did not necessarily endorse everything that we wrote, they provided a really important input into our analysis as well. So as far as my chapter is concerned, pardon me, I addressed two different issues. What is China's likely response to a denial force posture? And what should the United States do to try to mitigate adverse consequences? I would say that to begin with, I mean, the news is not fantastic on this score. We don't think the Chinese would react in a super positive way to even this denial, not control-oriented force structure. At the very least, I think they would continue to see this as an effort to prevent China from using its military to reinforce various aspects of deterrence messaging in Asia regarding Taiwan, regarding other nations, maritime disputes, etc. And at worst, they could regard it as an effort to keep China subject to American dictates and preferences over a wide range of issues. In other words, they would still be suspicious. And that's a reflection of the larger problem that we have in US-China relations today. So the strategy would not be terribly reassuring to the Chinese. They would think that force dispersal, for example, and an increased reliance on cruise missiles, et cetera, would simply just undermine Chinese capabilities in various areas, and they wouldn't put a huge emphasis on the reassurance aspects of the strategy. Now, they could respond to this, therefore, in some pretty negative ways. They could augment their existing capabilities vis-a-vis Japan to try and deter it from becoming involved. They could want to signal to Tokyo, however, that they would not attack Japan in a Taiwan conflict if Tokyo were to refuse permission for the use of US bases. Such actions could very well put Tokyo in a difficult position in a conflict. And also they could do other things to try to prevent a successful US intervention by acting in a way as a kind of fait accompli, to act quickly in order to avert the possibility of the United States bringing in other forces from out of theater. But that is a pretty dangerous strategy to undertake for the Chinese, that they could think would regard that they could get success with a high level of probability. So given these kinds of suspicions, however, and possible Chinese responses, this puts all the more pressure, all the more importance on the need to have some measures accompanying this strategy to reduce tensions, to try to build confidence, and to lower the chances of miscalculation. We don't think that Beijing would categorically resist all types of dialogues or agreements with the US to lower tensions or avoid such miscalculations or inadvertent escalation. So we think there's a lot of different things that we should be doing. And in fact, we should be doing these things even with or without a denial-oriented strategy to try to mitigate the chances of escalation and worst case suspicions. Now, what would some of these be? I'll just tick off a couple. One of them would be some kind of effort to try to establish greater efficacy and reliability of hotlines between the United States and China. We already have a hotline. It works, but it doesn't work terribly well in some cases. There are other options for improving those kinds of hotlines with the Chinese that would be more, I think, more predictable, more reliable, but they would have to be very carefully worked out. But there certainly are possible. There's a precedent for it, and I think the Chinese would be receptive to it. We could also create a very specific channel to conduct what are called non-conversations in a crisis with the Chinese. And what are they? These are channels by which a senior US and a senior Chinese official would get together and they would talk in a more give and take way, communicating and discussing different messages and different suspicions, interpretations of messaging in ways that would not necessarily commit to policy moves, but would convey the underlying concerns that each side had or would have in the event of a crisis. There's also a series of discussions the United States should try to push forward with to try to reduce the possibility of nuclear escalation in a confrontation with China over Taiwan or somewhere else. And then finally, there are several things that we think need to be done to lower the chance of the various hotspots in Asia generating a crisis in the first place. Regarding Taiwan, we believe there must be a much more credible US policy statements and signals designed to reassure Beijing of the continued US commitment to its one China, to the US one China policy. These could be publicly stated limits on the level and type of leadership and contacts and defense ties between Washington and Taipei. And the US, in addition, however, should avoid any actions or statements that reinforce or suggest the idea that Taiwan is a vital US strategic asset to be kept out of PRC hands. This would be a direct violation of the assurances provided under the One China policy. On its side, of course, we should also ask the Chinese that they reduce the level of sorties and the level of military pressure that they place on Taiwan in response to US actions taken that would be also designed to be destabilizing, more stabilizing in some respects. In the South China Sea, there's a range of other things that we could also do that would reduce the tendency towards conflict, including a no first use pledge by Beijing and other claimants regarding the use of conventional military force or other commercial or other coercive efforts to try to dislodge or seriously degrade the capabilities of rival claimants on different disputed territories. In the Korean Peninsula, we think the United States should really pursue a two-track kind of approach to try to cap nuclear capabilities while moving forward with some version of a peace effort and a peace regime, beginning with a declaration of end to the war and then moving on to a peace treaty at some point in the future. So these are some of the issues that we think are possible, and we've discussed many more of them in the study that would reduce the potential for this, what we think is a more destabilizing strategy than a control strategy or an offensive strategy, but nonetheless, one that China could feel suspicious toward. We want to still reduce the tendency that it would be destabilizing beyond those other alternatives. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Michael. And at this point, I want to invite people to put questions into the Q&A, and we'll start weaving those in. And I also want to highlight, so in addition to the ground that we've covered so far, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric in just a minute to cover some more specific recommendations we have for US force structure and for our posture in the region. But in addition to these components, we also have another chapter written by Eric Gomez, one of our 10 authors, about the implications of an active denial strategy for nuclear stability. And I highly recommend that chapter as well. And the basic argument there is that active denial, while any military conflict between two nuclear armed powers, of course, has risks of nuclear escalation, whether deliberate or accidental, active denial is designed in a way that will reduce those pressures. And that's in fact one of the main reasons why we think this is a strategy that urgently needs to be implemented by the United States. So, and he also has some really great recommendations in there for approaches to nuclear arms control and for ways to think about proliferation in the region. So highly recommend that chapter as well. But now at this point, I want to turn over to Eric before we open it up to a broader Q&A to walk us through some of the specific recommendations for US presence in the region and for how we structure our forces.
Right, great, thanks. And we want to get to Q&A, so I'll try to be very brief. Rachel mentioned force structure and force posture. These are not the DoD definitions, but our sort of working definition of these things. Force structure is the number and composition of units maintained by the US military. So that's going to encompass sort of all of our acquisitions and weapon systems, manning, et cetera. And then force posture is the location and nature of our basing during peacetime and the positioning of, and I think, employment during wartime. So sort of how they're positioned and used during wartime as well. Okay, given the evolution of military technology, as well as the specific attributes of the theater and our desire to execute an active denial strategy, we had a number of sort of basic propositions or broad propositions about adjustments to force structure and posture. To tick those off, one is to downsize ground maneuver forces, especially air and naval capabilities. Now, I'm not going to talk in detail about all these points, but I will stop there. We do treat the entire US military. We are focused on Asia. Asia is the main driver. We can talk about European needs, but our European NATO allies, have a combined GDP that's about 800% of Russia's. They don't have corresponding capabilities yet, but it is dramatically different. We do not propose in the report that we shouldn't be engaged in NATO. So, we're assuming that we continue to be engaged in NATO and supply forces. And we sort of sketch out what we think reasonable ground requirements would be given the involvement of NATO currently and into the future. But in any case, overall, if you believe Asia is where the primary challenges are, the United States in that one region is really sort of the indispensable power. We do suggest priorities have to be made, and therefore downsizing ground maneuver forces in particular and emphasizing air and naval capabilities. Second is the reduction of overhead and command redundancies. I mean, that's kind of an easy thing to say, but it is true that, as we've reorganized our forces around new types of units, we have not gotten rid of the old types. So as we reorganize around brigade combat teams, the divisions are still sitting there, right? But they don't have the same function that they used to. So there are several levels at which reductions can be made. Third, introducing lighter, more attritable, but still lethal and networked systems. Fourth, greater emphasis on logistics and expeditionary packaging and less on platforms. So if you want to be dispersed, if you want to operate in a dispersed manner, if you want to be mobile, agile, to be able to move around, to defend yourself, to be resilient, in other words, there's a much higher requirement for logistics and sustainment. And we've got to pay the price for that. At present, we haven't done too much of that. We've reorganized a bit to be more efficient, but we haven't really reapportioned our finances to match. A fourth is preparation of the battlefield and building necessary infrastructure. So I'm just going to throw out one example here. I don't think I talked about it later. And that is hardening. So during the latter parts of the Cold War, we built 1,000 hardened aircraft shelters, mostly in Europe, a little bit in northern Japan. Despite the fact that the threat to air bases is far higher today, we have not continued to build hardened aircraft shelters. The Koreans built us a few in Korea, but virtually none have been added in Japan over the last decades, despite the increased threat. Now, those things cost money. Yes, they cost $7 million a piece. but no sane analyst I've ever spoken to suggests that we should be parking $100 million aircraft out in the open on tarmacs. All right, 6, avoid making starkly binary choices. So we can talk about priorities, but we shouldn't, put all of our eggs into one basket. So yes, reapportion priorities, but don't say, all we need are submarines. Then you're creating a single point of failure and really an invitation to big problems down the road. All right, I'll just tick off a few, maybe 3 of the biggest changes for each of the services. For the US Air Force, a number of broad recommendations. First is to rejuvenate the fighter force, built around new platforms, 5th, 6th, and new 4th, 4.5 generation fighters. So in other words, new builds of, in a sense, older models, but updated. So this shift would require the accelerated retirement of older aircraft. It would bring the average age of the air fleet down from 30 plus years to about 10 years. So right now, the US Air Force is spending a very high percentage of its budget and an increasing percentage of its budget to sustain very old aircraft. So there are other proposals out there to increase the size of the Air Force, but we go the other direction. This would result in a somewhat smaller force structure than we have today. So 48 squadrons by 2035, as opposed to the 53 that we have today. But we don't really have the bases, certainly not secure bases, to dispatch forces of that size to Asia in any case. What we really want are agile and effective aircraft. Second, the reorganization of combat support. We've already talked a little bit about that, so I won't say more. But the Air Force is operating what they call an ACE concept, Agile Combat Operations. Again, very high emphasis on dispersion and mobility, but we'll need more logistics. Our wargaming suggests that the US could lose, the nature of losses would be quite different than historical cases. We'd lose a lot more on the ground, we'd lose a lot more airframes and maintainers and support personnel, and far fewer in the air, pilots. So it stands to reason that we should not be organized along old principles. The third recommendation is to greatly increase funding for base hardening. We already talked about that, and other measures to improve resiliency. So deception, camouflage, concealment, et cetera. The Pacific Deterrence Initiative is supposed to be doing this, but I think to a large extent, it's been hijacked. We could talk about that. Okay, US Navy recommendations. Again, just the top few. We recommend a relatively greater emphasis on small ships than is currently the case. So currently the Navy is sort of built around 11 large carriers. We recommend the introduction of mid-sized carriers, which the US has not maintained in many decades, roughly modeled on the current America class amphibious assault ship. So we would sort of adjust the design of that ship to create a mid-sized aircraft carrier that would have about half the complement of aircraft, would have a little bit less than half the capability of a full-size aircraft carrier. But we could replace full-size carriers on a 2-to-1 basis. And we would not be, I think we could use those farther forward earlier in a conflict, complicate an adversary's targeting problem, and not put at risk these giant symbols of national prestige that have 5,000 personnel on board at any one time. Similarly, we recommend a shift to smaller surface combatants, so relatively more frigates and relatively fewer destroyers, no replacement for the current cruiser class. Again, greater emphasis on support ships as well. If we're going to be moving around the theater and trying to transport ground, air defense units, and other types of supplies around the theater, we're going to need more intra-theater lift in particular. Finally, we see value in unmanned systems, but do advise a degree of caution when it comes to some of the larger, more expensive systems. So there have been some proposals out there to create some fairly significantly sized unmanned surface vessels. But the mission sets are not terribly clear yet, and we would advise a degree of caution on those. All right, we already talked about the ground forces. I won't go into too many specifics there. I will say both have tried to make themselves more relevant to East Asia. So the Navy has littoral, marine littoral regiments now. The Army has multi-domain task forces. They have concepts of operation for those. Overall, we find the marine concepts a little bit more compelling, but also are somewhat skeptical that either one could be used at scale. We do think they have a role, particularly if the emphasis is shifted a bit to provide more air defense, which has not traditionally been a terribly high priority for any of our services since we've had a dominant Air Force. But in any case, some adjustment of priorities in both the Army and the Marines, but also significant cuts. And this is where we find our savings to improve capabilities elsewhere. So we recommend cuts of the total force, largely centered on reserve forces, but from the total force, which is now 71 brigades and regiments, again, including the reserves, to a force of about 41 brigades and regiments. And we could talk about whether or not that should be delayed for a time, given what's going on in Ukraine. But in any case, that is our long-term vision. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eric. And now I want to start bringing in some of the questions. We've got a lot of great questions in the chat. The first batch I want to bring in are questions about Taiwan. So obviously there's been a lot of tensions in the Taiwan Strait recently, and this is probably the most likely source of potential conflict between the United States and China. So there's a range of questions here, and I think different ones that each of the panelists could speak to. So there's the basic question of, what do you mean by a hedgehog strategy? This is something we call for in the report. What kind of specific recommendations for Taiwan would you recommend? And something I'll just note here is that in the report, we call for Taiwan and the United States to, in essence, develop parallel denial strategies. We favor the maintenance of strategic ambiguity. And although there are some disagreements among report authors about exactly what that means and whether or not the United States should get directly involved in a conflict over Taiwan, we certainly believe that strategic ambiguity requires that the United States have some credible capability to intervene, to sort of raise that doubt in China's mind. And so if Eric, if you could speak to what some of the recommendations are for Taiwan. And then there's also a question just basically about whether we think China will attack Taiwan to try to force it back under China's control, and how should the United States respond? And Michael, perhaps you could speak a little bit to that, and you've already somewhat addressed it. But then thirdly, there's a question about would a Chinese invasion or attempted invasion of Taiwan trigger Japan into becoming a nuclear power? Would China consider this a realistic outcome, and might it discourage China from invading in the first place? Or is China so committed to controlling Taiwan that it'd be willing to ignore the risk of a nuclear armed Japan? So if you could each just try to keep your answers as brief as possible so we can get to some more questions, but each take a stab at those questions.
Great. So a question on a hedgehog strategy. So the hedgehog strategy is essentially what we're talking about for the states of Asia, for our partner states. That would be part of a broader combined alliance or partnership denial strategy. In general, militaries, for bureaucratic reasons, tend to like, high prestige, conventional forces. So Taiwan, for example, when we discuss their military requirements, they often talk about getting more advanced aircraft and large warships. Now, unfortunately, large systems in this environment with this many missiles around are very, very vulnerable, especially when they're that close to China. So a hedgehog strategy is one, as the name suggests, that is tough and imposes some pain on somebody who might mean them harm. So for Taiwan, for example, this would be a strategy that would see dispersed anti-ship missiles. So China, in order to invade, for example, would have to park an amphibious fleet off Taiwan's coast. So if you had anti-ship missiles dispersed on trucks that could be hidden across Taiwan's very rough terrain, those could impose a tremendous cost on China's fleet and would, system for system, be quite inexpensive and would not be subject to the type of devastating attack that we would really expect all of Taiwan's major systems to be subject to. So that's what we're talking about. It would be the specific structure, it would be tailored for different countries. It would look a little bit different for Japan than it would for Taiwan, for example, but that's the general gist of this.
Great, thanks. And Michael, do you have any quick thoughts on the broader question of whether China is likely to attack and how the US should respond?
Sure. You cannot discount the possibility that China would attack Taiwan. I certainly wouldn't predict to it. And I think people are a little bit too rash in doing that in some quarters. the costs and the risks involved in China attacking Taiwan would be enormous, and they would not necessarily succeed. So I think the Chinese would look at this very carefully. But nonetheless, the solution here is not just simply to pile on at never-ending levels of military deterrence. It is to try to reassure all sides that conflict is the worst possible way to proceed. And you do that in part vis-a-vis the Chinese by, as we said, injecting greater credibility into the one China policy, not treating Taiwan as a formal ally, the way we treat Japan or South Korea, and yet keeping our deterrence capabilities there, but working very assiduously to reduce China's sense of worst casing and to reduce our own worst casing by trying to establish a continued stable foundation based on the one China policy indefinitely until we can transition to a policy in which either China or Taiwan or the United States begins to look at the problem in somewhat different ways, and we can transition away from this kind of military-based assessment of what the outcome of the Taiwan situation should be. The solution is not a military one, it is a political one to establish confidence and stability so that neither side feels compelled to use military efforts to try to really overcome or deter the other side, use those efforts alone.
Great, thanks, Michael. Now, Mike, could you speak a little bit to the role of Japan in a Taiwan contingency, and perhaps, and especially to Stuart Kaplan's question about, would it be advantageous for Japan to nuclearize or not in this contingency?
Right. So right now, I don't think we can say at all how Japan would respond after the end of a Taiwan contingency or after China has invaded Taiwan. One needs to figure out what the strategic environment looks after a contingency like that, and I would not discount out of hand the possibility of Japanese nuclearization, but nor do I see Japanese nuclearization as inevitable because there are so many strong domestic constraints against nuclearization. But I think the important issue is what can Japan do to help deter China from using military force against Taiwan? And I don't think that a fear that Japan will go nuclear is what will help deter China. And what would help deter China is for Japan to do the things that are consistent with the active denial strategy, such as acquire more air and sea-based standoff weapon systems that can be used defensively in interdiction operations. This is very effective because Japan is so close to Taiwan. It will be part of the theater in which the Taiwan contingency takes place. Japan should also invest in air and missile defense capabilities to protect U.S. and Japanese defense assets in Japan. And as Eric has argued, Japan should really play an active role in helping to harden air bases and enhance the resilience of existing bases, enhance the mobility, and cooperate with the United States for the rapid dispersal of U.S. Air capabilities during the crisis. And so if Japan did those sorts of things, I think it would really be much more effective in deterring China from using force against Taiwan, rather than adopting some kind of explicit nuclear hedging policy.
Thanks very much, Mike. And so now I want to turn to a question from Christopher Preble, who, and I'll take this one on. He asked, you explained that one of the three core goals is affordability. So what cost savings do you estimate will be derived from your revised force structure and posture? Or are you assuming the budget will continue to grow, but less quickly under the strategy? So if Stephen Koziak were on this panel, he will be able to give you even more details. He's our budgetary expert and wrote the sections of the report dealing with that. But I can give the bottom line answer, which is that vis-a-vis under the Trump administration's last defense budget plan, the defense budget would grow from about $704 billion per year to about $781 billion per year by 2035. So that was the last plan. Now, what our recommendations would do is they would cut vis-a-vis that plan by 10%, on average of 10% per year over that time frame. And what this has in terms of relative to current levels is that through the 2020 to 2035 period, funding for defense will be held at an average annual level roughly comparable to that of 2021. So in other words, what we're arguing is that this active denial strategy, by being cost sensitive to these cost concerns, is able to keep our defense budget the same level it was last year, while also effectively deterring China, potential aggression from China over this time period. And this stands in contrast to the recommendations of other think tank reports in recent years and of the previous administration, which are calling for 3 to 5% annual increases, each year to be able to deal with this challenge. And we're arguing firmly that doesn't need to happen. We can't afford that. And we can keep defense spending at the same levels and achieve significant reductions vis-a-vis the most recent plans. So having answered that, I want to bring in a couple of questions that are a little more critical of the report. From the perspective, John Mueller, for example, asks, some of the report authors think that beyond a few territorial disputes, China doesn't present much of a threat, but others say that Beijing's use of economic sanctions, cyber attacks, and disinformation campaigns are evidence it is a much wider threat. This gets back to the areas where we have some disagreements in the group. So, but he points out that the US has used a lot of these tactics. And so why does this present a threat requiring active denial when China does it? So let's see, Michael, could you speak to this kind of basic question? And again, some of this reflects differences in the group, but if you could give your perspective on that.
Rachel, could you just, I'm sorry, I was responding to another question here that was sent to one of the, sent to us. Just very briefly, repeat the question, please.
Well, maybe I'll toss it over to Eric Higginbotham in the interest of time. Go ahead, Eric.
So, like Rachel said, there were a wide range of views about grand strategy and really about the nature of the challenges that we face, about China itself. That was the point, in a way, was to get a broad group of folks together to see if there was common ground on military strategy. And it was certainly, the most enjoyable part of the project, I think, was to see a meeting of the minds among people who have diverse views of China. So, in my view, China is a very, very different actor from Russia, which I would maybe describe as a spoiler, almost pure and simple, right? From a Chinese perspective, almost anything that hurts, from a Russian perspective, almost anything that hurts US interests, contributes to achieving Russian interests. Some may disagree, but in any case, that's my view of Russia, but it's definitely not my view of China. On the other hand, I think the group did generally agree that it's difficult to predict China's future course. They do have some revisionist aims today, certainly with regard to Taiwan, other territorial disputes, and those might change over time. We've heard about what people have described as a more assertive China. That's different from necessarily a more aggressive China, but there has been a change in the tenor of Chinese activity and behavior, its rhetoric with regard to smaller states in particular, where it's willing to use coercive means, even when those aren't military. So I think we, as a group, believed that a deterrent strategy was important. Certainly if we didn't have one, I think there's little doubt in my mind that you would see proliferation in Asia, starting with probably Korea, possibly even Japan first, in the event that the US really got out of Asia. So those are some of the reasons that we thought military strategy very important, and the maintenance of deterrence capability, hopefully less sort of provocative ones. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. I want to let Michael answer a question from Donghui Yu in the chat about what his views are on the feasibility of a deterrent strategy, if you could clarify on that point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel. I don't by any means think that the denial strategy is infeasible and that it's not something that should be done. Obviously, I'm part of the project and I support it very much. I think it is much better than the alternatives that are out there right now. But it's not a panacea. It's not going to suddenly magically change the strategic situation in Asia. It's not going to suddenly put us on a positive reinforcing path with the Chinese. They will still be suspicious. They will still try to counter what they see as the negative elements of this. But that puts all the more emphasis on the need to be clear about what this strategy is and is not, how it could be stabilizing and likely would be stabilizing if it's implemented, and what could be done and should be done to try to avert a conflict in the first place. And if a conflict were to occur, to try to manage it, or a crisis were to occur, to try to manage it in ways that really would reduce escalation and reduce the expansion of a conflict or expansion of a crisis. And I think we address all of these issues in the context of this denial strategy. So for me, it is certainly the best option out there.
Thanks very much, Michael. And with that, we need to wrap up. There's enough, a lot of great additional questions I wish we could have gotten to, but keep watching Responsible Statecraft. The authors will be writing articles on various aspects of this report over coming months. And I just want to conclude, and this does address a few of the remaining comments. I want to just reiterate that this strategy is looking at what the US military should be doing differently going forward. It's not looking at what the United States should be doing differently going forward. And as the Quincy Institute has argued elsewhere, and as Michael Swain and Jessica Lee and I argued in a report last year, it's crucial that the United States actually shift away from an emphasis on military tools of power, that we need to be investing more in economic engagement, in engagement around human security issues like countering climate change, which will require cooperation with China. So this is the focus of this report, in part because we believe that the current trajectory of United States defense strategy is putting us on the path to a dangerous conflict with China. And we need to make sure that we make that conflict less likely by having a more effective deterrence strategy, and B, that we make sure that we aren't actually incentivizing rapid early escalation. Again, this isn't a panacea. It doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't make competition go away. But we're hoping that through this strategy, the United States can better manage that, make it safer, make it more less likely to escalate in ways that would be bad for the region and bad for the world and bad for the United States. All right, Kelly, hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. I think you said it best in terms of concluding the discussion, which was unbelievable and just a ton of great material there. I was very impressed you could get through it all. But if listeners want to see the full report, just go to quincyinst.org, go to the reports tab. It's at the top of the page. For the full document is there for all to see. Thank you, Michael, Mike, Eric, Rachel. Please come back to quincyinst.org for all of our future events. Just come on just to see everything that we offer. And thank you so much for this wonderful discussion.